Hello students, I welcome you back to this session once more. Today we will complete the chapter which we had already started in our previous class. I do hope that you have already understood whatever we had learnt in the previous class, and today we will move ahead. Are you all ready? I hope so. So let's move ahead and start the remaining portion of the chapter Weathering the Storm in Ersama. Okay. Eventually Prashant reached his village Kalikuda. His heart went cold. Where their home once stood, there were only remnants of its roof. Some of their belongings were caught, mangled and twisted in the branches of trees just visible above the dark waters. Young Prashant decided to go to the Red Cross shelter to look for his family. So finally Prashant had reached his village Kalikuda. His village was Kalikuda. And when he reached there, his heart went cold. He seemed to be stunned and left shocked because he could not see his house. The place where his house was there, it had nothing, only remnants. Remnants means the broken parts, the left out parts, those were remnants, some broken pieces of the roof of the house. The house was nowhere to be seen, and some of the belongings which belonged to them, they were here and there lying in the branches of the trees, and they were just visible above the dark waters. So he decided to go to the Red Cross shelter. Maybe if somebody would have survived, then there are organizations, students, which help the people when they are in need, whenever these kind of disasters are there. So there are these organizations, Red Cross being the most prominent one, which always come to the rescue of the people. So Red Cross Society was there to take care of the destitute and the needy, and Prashant decided to visit to the Red Cross shelter. Maybe he could find his family there. Among the first people he saw in the crowd was his maternal grandmother. Weak with hunger, she rushed to him, her hands outstretched, her eyes brimming. It was a miracle. They had long given him up for the dead. So now, the first person to see in the crowd was his maternal grandmother. So he could trace out his grandmother. It was such an emotional moment for Prashant because he had found his grandmother in that crowd. And when his grandmother saw him, she rushed to him. She could not believe that Prashant was there. She was looking starved. She had not eaten for so many days. It was all visible. Her eyes were filled up with tears, her eyes brimming. So it was all filled up with tears. It was definitely a miracle for Prashant to see his grandmother safe and alive in front of him. Because his family members also, even they thought that Prashant could never be seen. They had made up their minds that Prashant was dead. So his maternal grandmother was so relieved to see Prashant in front of her. So they had thought that Prashant was already dead. So it was just a miracle because they could see Prashant. So grandmother saw Prashant, and then what happened? We are going to know from the next paragraph. Quickly word spread and his extended family gathered around him and hugged him tight in relief. Prashant anxiously scanned the motley, battered group. His brother and sister, his uncles and aunts, they all seemed to be there. Now the news of his reaching his village had already spread, and his extended family, they all came from so many places to meet him. They hugged him and they were all so relieved to see Prashant alive and all safe. And Prashant anxiously scanned the motley. This was a mixed group, heterogeneous group, though these people were different, and he was happy to see them. He could see all his family members. There were his brothers and sisters, his uncles and aunts. Everyone was there, and it was such a great relief for all of them to be together in this desperate situation. So now let us see the story. By the next morning, as he took in the desperate situation in the shelter, he decided to get a grip over himself. He sensed a deathly grief settling upon the 2,500 strong crowd in the shelter. 86 lives were lost in the village. All the 96 houses had been washed away. It was their fourth day at the shelter. So far, they had survived on green coconuts, but there were too few to go around such a tumult of people. So by the next morning, he could feel the devastation of this situation and the situation in the shelter. And he decided then and there itself that he had to do something. He had to help these people, those who were so much broken. He could feel the pain of the people because there were 2,500 people in the shelter. So many lives were lost. 86 people in the village, they had lost their lives. You can imagine someone would have lost his father, someone his wife, someone her husband, someone his children. So they had lost so many people, those who were so much near and dear to them. It was not easy to compensate anything to this loss. So the houses also, there were around 96 houses which had been washed away in this situation, and it was their fourth day at the shelter, and they were struggling very hard. So all the 96 houses in the village, they were all destroyed, they had been washed away, and the people of the village, they had taken shelter in the Red Cross shelter house, and it was the fourth day, and so far they were all starving there because there was no food. There were so many people and there was no food for them. The food was not adequate, the food was not there, and they had to survive on green coconuts, and they were also getting decreased in number. There were very few coconuts left to feed so many people, to such a tumult of people, to such a big crowd of people. The coconuts were not adequate. Prashant, all of 19 years, decided to step in as leader of his village if no one else did. He organized a group of youths and elders to jointly pressurize the merchant once again to part with his rice. This time the delegation succeeded and returned triumphantly, wading through the receding waters with food for the entire shelter. No one cared that the rice was already rotting. Branches from fallen trees were gathered to light a reluctant and slow fire on which to cook the rice. For the first time in 4 days, the survivors at the cyclone shelter were able to fill their bellies. Now, Prashant thought that he had to do something about this situation. Somebody had to take an initiative. There is always a leader, and he had to take the position of the leader because there was no leader in this village to come out and help in this difficult situation. So he decided to be the leader. He had to get into the position of the leader. So he gathered a group of young people, because young people are very enthusiastic and energetic, and he knew that they would help him. He thought he had to take the help of some elderly people also who had to supervise him, who could mentor him all in this difficult situation. So he had a group of the young people as well as the elderlies to help him out in this situation. And they jointly decided that they had to move to the merchant who was not willing to help these people, and he had to part with his rice. He had to help them with whatever rice he had in his stock. So he decided along with the other people, and they moved to the merchant, and this time they all were successful, because whenever things are done collectively, whenever the things are done in group, the things are always very, very successful. And this happened this time. This team, this delegation, this team was able to succeed, and they returned triumphantly with the victory. They brought the rice for all the people. They had to swim all through the water level which was coming down in some way, and there was food for all the people in the shelter. None of them cared that the rice was not of good quality. It was already rotting. It was not of good quality. They had to feed the hungry. So they didn't care whatever was the quality of the rice. For the first time in the 4 days, all these people got to eat, and they cooked the rice with a very slow fire. Even the fire was not willing to light up. So the reluctant and slow fire was there, and the rice was cooked. And all these people, after 4 long days, the survivors, these people were the survivors because they had survived this devastating storm, the cyclone, and they got food, and they were able to fill their bellies for the first time in these 4 days. His next task was to organize a team of youth volunteers to clean the shelter of filth, urine, vomit and floating carcasses, and to tend to the wounds and fractures of the many who had been injured. So this was not the only task. He had his another assignment to take care of, and it was to clean the village, because dirt, because of this filth, again there could be more diseases, and that could affect the health of the survivors also. So they had to be extra careful, and he thought of that. So he organized a team of youth volunteers, the young people, those who can help him to clean the shelter, which was completely filled of all this urine and vomiting of people, and there were floating carcasses of the animals also, and there were some people who had to tend, who had to heal the wounds and the fractures of the people, those who had already been wounded and injured. So he organized a team for that also. So Prashant had taken an active role in helping the people of his village to overcome this difficult situation. Now let us move to the next paragraph. On the 5th day, a military helicopter flew over the shelter and dropped some food parcels. It then did not return. The youth task force gathered empty utensils from the shelter. Then they deputed the children to lie in the sand left by the waters around the shelter with these utensils on their stomachs, to communicate to the passing helicopters that they were hungry. The message got through, and after that the helicopter made regular rounds of the shelter, airdropping food and other basic needs. Now on the 5th day, these rescue operations are there. The government helps these people a lot, because these people need to get sufficient amount of food and the materials which they need to survive in this situation. So the government does its part, and it had sent a military helicopter to drop the food parcels, but unfortunately it came just once and it did not return, and the food parcels which were dropped were not enough. So the message had to reach the authorities, and the youth task force, which was a very active and enthusiastic group. So what they did, they gathered all the empty utensils from the shelter house. So they gathered all those utensils, and what they did, they got some children with them, and the children were asked to lie on the sand. The water had already moved away and the sand was there. So the children were asked to lie down with the utensils on their stomachs. There would be reflection, and the message could be communicated to the passing helicopters. There would be some kind of reflection, because from such a distance it was not easy to figure out, not easy to make out where land is there, where shelter is there. They might have some problems to understand. So this was a way of communicating to the passing helicopters that they were hungry, and it worked out. This idea was a success and the message reached the people, and after that the helicopters, they made regular rounds of the shelter and they were dropping the food through air and other basic needs. Let us see what happened next. Prashant found that a large number of children had been orphaned. He brought them together and put up a polythene sheet shelter for them. Women were mobilized to look after them, while the men secured food and materials for the shelter. This is a perfect leader, and Prashant was really doing a great work. He got to know that there are many children who had lost their parents. So he brought them all together and he got a separate shelter for them by arranging a polythene sheet shelter for all of them, and he deputed these women to look after them, and he deputed the men to do the work for the food and other related works for the shelter. So in this way he engaged all the people of the shelter in different assignments which would keep them busy and to also overcome their grief, because all of them were very much shattered because of this situation. Many had lost their near and dear ones and they were all in a very grieved situation. So it was very important to bring them all out of that sad and menacing situation. So Prashant tried all his best. As the weeks passed, Prashant was quick to recognize that the women and children were sinking deeper and deeper in their grief. He persuaded the women to start working in the Food for Work program started by an NGO, and for the children he organized sports event. Prashant could see that as the time was passing by, the women and children, these people are very emotional and very sensitive people, and they were sinking deep and deep in their grief because it is not easy to accept the whole situation. They had lost their close members of the family and it was not easy for all of them to accept it so easily. So this pain, this grief was making them weak. Prashant realized that this is the situation, then I have to do something to make them overcome their grief. So he persuaded the women, he encouraged, he motivated these women to start working in the Food for Work program. Once these women will be busy in some work, then they would not get that much time to think about the past and think about and mourn for the dead. So it would be easier for the women. So he helped them to work in that Food for Work program, which was initiated by an NGO. And to engage the children, he organized sports events. Children love playing, children love sports. So he knew the interest of children and he engaged these children in various sports events. He himself loved to play cricket and so he organized cricket matches for children. Prashant engaged with other volunteers in helping the widows and children to pick up the broken pieces of their lives. So Prashant had other friends also who were in his team who were very active volunteers, the young people. They helped, they tried their best to help these widows and children to come back to their lives again and accept the reality. So he tried to join the broken pieces of their lives, and this was a great effort by Prashant and his team members. The initial government plan was to set up institutions for orphans and widows. However, this step was successfully resisted as it was felt that in such institutions children would grow up without love and widows would suffer from stigma and loneliness. So there are always these plans of government to help the needy, but sometimes these are not feasible practically. So the same thing happened here. The government had initially planned for a institution which would take care of these orphans and widows, but this plan was completely resisted, was opposed by the village members because they felt that in these kinds of institutions, children would be all left alone and they would not get that care, that love and affection which they really need at that tender age, and the widows would be also left to suffer with the pain of loneliness and they would be left with all those stigma. So the whole village resisted, they opposed this idea of government, okay, and they wanted to do something which would be really fruitful for these people. Let it be the widows, let it be the children, they should not be left all alone to suffer. So they thought of something else. What did they think of? So Prashant's group believed orphans should be resettled in their own community itself, possibly in new foster families made up of childless widows and children without adult care. So Prashant had another idea, his group had the same idea. They believed that the children, those who were orphan, they should be resettled in their own community, the same community itself, because there would be people, those who know them. They could be given new families which are made up of childless widows. The widows, those who do not have any child, the children should be given to those kind of ladies, those who have lost their children, and the children, those who do not have anyone to look after. So there would be this ultimate connection of the children and the widows, and they will take care of each other. So it was a very great thought. It really worked out. So it is 6 months after the devastation of the super cyclone. This time Prashant's wounded spirit has healed simply because he had no time to bother about his own pain. His handsome youthful face is what the widows and orphaned children of his village seek out most in their darkest hour of grief. So the cyclone came and left everyone shattered, and the things were destroyed completely. But this thing had not left Prashant completely devastated, because his wounded spirit which was there, it was healed, because this time he had no time to think about his pain. Earlier, when his mother left, he was completely shattered, but this time he gathered all his courage to help the people, those who were really in need, and he was a great example, he was a great ideal for the people of the village, because he was youthful, he was cheerful, and his handsome and youthful face is what the people of the village, whether they are the widows or the orphan children, they always wanted to see him, and his spirit gave them all the strength and the motivation they needed to overcome their grief. So this is the story which tells us to help people whenever we can and with whatever resources we have. We should not always rely on other sources and think that when they come they only will help us. No, you have to fight on your own, you have to struggle, and you have to find out the way for yourself, because it is said where there is a will there is a way, and Prashant had a fighting spirit, and Prashant had a determined willpower to help his people of the village, and that's why he did it. I know that you all have understood the chapter very well, and now we will see what have you understood. So here we go. The first question for you: how has Prashant, a teenager, been able to help the people of his village? I repeat the question: how has Prashant, a teenager, been able to help the people of his village? I know you got the answer right. Yes. So the answer is, on reaching his village, Prashant found deplorable conditions all around him. He had leadership qualities, so he took the initiative to rehabilitate people. He made a team of young volunteers and cleaned urine, filth, vomit, and floating carcasses. His team was fully dedicated to serve others. He persuaded grief-stricken women to look after children. In this way, he became a ray of hope for all. So, students, we also have to try our best to become such rays of hopes for ourselves as well as others, isn't it? Okay, let us move to the next question. How have the people of the community helped one another? And what role do the women of Kalikuda play during these days? There are two questions. So, I repeat the question once more. How have the people of the community helped one another? And what role do the women of Kalikuda play during these days? I know you have already answered it. Let's check it out. Prashant took the initiative and mobilized everyone to help one another. In this time of distress, the people of the community joined hands together and started relief work. Women started working in the Food for Work program and looked after the orphans. Okay, so this was the answer. And now let us move to the next question. Why do Prashant and other volunteers resist the plan to set up institutions for orphans and widows? And what alternatives do they consider? So here also you have two questions to answer. Why do Prashant and other volunteers resist the plan to set up institutions for orphans and widows? And what alternatives do they consider? So you might have already got your answer, isn't it? Yes. So let us check it out whether you all are right or wrong. So here is the answer for you. Prashant and other volunteers resisted the plan as they felt that it would not be proper to set up separate institutions for orphans and widows who would suffer from stigma and loneliness and isolation. The group decided to rehabilitate them in their own community. New families were made and the childless widows took care of the orphans. So this is all, and we have a very good discussion of all the question and answers. Hope you would be able to write the answers in your own words and in a good language. So students, I do hope that you have all understood the chapter very nicely, and the message which was conveyed through the story would have reached to you in a proper way, isn't it? So students, we have come to an end of our chapter Weathering the Storm in Ersama. I do wish the message has exactly reached to your mind as well as your hearts, and you are going to implement it in your lives. So with this notion, I leave here and will meet you again in another session of an exciting and interesting chapter. Till then, keep studying and enjoying. Thank you. Bye-bye.